call the meeting to order. This is the Standing Committee on Citizenship and Immigration, meeting number 28, Thursday, March 15th, 2012. This meeting is televised. The orders of the day, standing on guard for thee and ensuring that Canada's immigration system is secure. We have two witnesses today who are appearing by video conference from Toronto, although I think they're both from the region of Peel, but I'm not sure. Dr. Natasha Crowcroft, who is the Director of Surveillance and Epidemiology, the Ontario Agency for Health Protection and Promotion. She is a physician specializing in public health and infectious diseases, particularly with respect to immunization. She's been Scientific Director of Surveillance and Epidemiology. I'm having trouble with that word, and I'm sure you'll help me later. At Public Health Ontario, since shortly after Ontario's new agency started operations in 2008. She is also an Associate Professor at the University of Toronto. Prior to immigrating to Canada with her family in 2007, Dr. Crowcroft worked for a decade at the United Kingdom's Health Protection Agency as a national expert in immunization. The second witness is Dr. Eileen Davila, who is the Associate Medical Officer of Communicable Diseases and Environmental Health, Peel Public Health. She is an Associate Medical Officer of Health for the region of Peel. Her responsibilities include providing technical support and medical expertise to public health staff in the management of cases and infectious disease outbreaks. I want to, on behalf of the committee, I'd like to thank both of you for appearing today by video conference to help us with our study on security. And you have between you 10 minutes. Thank you. You may begin.
Okay. Thank you very much. So I'm, as you probably see on your screen, I'm Natasha Crowcroft, and I work at provincial level in Canada, although I have international experience. And also, as an aside, I've been through the immigration experience myself, so have direct experience of some of the processes that we're going to discuss. And thank you very much for inviting us to speak. We're going to share the time, so Dr. Davila is going to take the second half, and I'm going to kick off. The reason I talk about working at provincial level is because there are different issues at federal level possibly, so we will be speaking from our own perspective and also from some international experience as well. And myself from a provincial perspective and Dr. Davila from a local public health perspective, and I think the two, we agree and they're very complementary, but I just flag that the Public Health Agency of Canada may have additional views to contribute to this conversation. So the scope of what we can speak to is within public health, so that's section 38 on health, and specifically the part that says applicants' health conditions are likely to be a danger to public health. We can't really speak to public safety or excessive demands on health or social services because that's not really in our area of expertise, so I wanted to make that clear. But I think there is a part that is relevant, not to health services, and here I don't want to get into too much jargon, but in our minds, when I speak for both of us probably, we think of public health as being distinct from health services, and that may not be true for members of the committee. So by health services, I would think of hospitals and primary care docs and that kind of context. Public health, which certainly in Ontario is based in municipalities, is another service to the public which relates to health, but it's not acute health care. And so there's an element to what we're talking about which concerns the impact on public health services, which are in a different place in many provinces and are funded in different ways. So I hope that's clear, but we'll obviously have an opportunity to take questions if any of that isn't clear. So I'm going to start off with one of the questions that seems to come out clearly from the audit about why Citizenship and Immigration Canada does not consider the 56 diseases that are currently reportable because of their risk to public health. And I think the important point here and the important consideration is that immigration is a slow process, and I would distinguish here between immigrants and refugees, and there are separate issues for refugees, but for most of the immigrants who arrive in Canada, it's a slow process, whereas in contrast, the 56 diseases that are reportable because of their risk to public health, these are generally, for the most part, diseases of short duration, and the process will really not capture them. Screening in that context is not the appropriate tool, and the appropriate place to take action to protect Canadians is at the point of travel at which somebody who has any of these diseases might present a risk, either to both to fellow travellers and also on arrival in Canada. If you think about SARS, which presented a considerable risk to public health, the immigrant screening process would have been irrelevant to protecting Canadians from that disease. It was a lot of other measures that were important to have in place. So most reportable diseases of a short duration, and the medical screening process is really not relevant. The danger to public health is from travellers who are ill at the point of travel, or just become ill just before, or incubating the disease just before and immediately afterwards. The other thing is about the proportionality, that the numbers of travellers into and out of Canada each year is way exceeds the numbers of people who arrive through immigration. So if you want to protect the health of Canadians, the focus really is not, it's disproportionate to focus on the point of immigration. It's the travel backwards and forwards, sometimes involving the same communities, to countries where diseases occur more frequently than within Canada. That really is the issue that would be most important to focus on to protect the health of Canadians. So another idea that I think is not, that's important to emphasise but is not really the focus of the audit, is the idea of screening as a health benefit for immigrants. And it's worth considering that most immigrants who come to immigrants in general who arrive in Canada are healthier than people living in Canada, the Canadian-born. They start out healthier and they become less healthy. So there's an element to which we are putting immigrants' health at risk by them coming to Canada. So, consideration from a public health perspective could easily be given to protecting the health of immigrants through screening for measures we know that are effective and will protect them from becoming ill while they're here. So some of the diseases which I think are reasonable things to screen for are really for the benefit of the immigrant rather than to protect public health. And
we have 4 minutes left. We have 4 minutes left.
Oh, I'm sorry. Okay. I'll hand over to you very quickly. So HIV, hepatitis B, hepatitis C are worth screening for. Complete immunisation records is another thing that would be a benefit to the immigrants' health, and that would be a good role for the CIC to take on. So, sorry, Anya.
No, not at all. So I will pick up from here. And you'll note on our next slide, we note with interest that the report of the Auditor General calls for better definition of applicants who present a danger to public health in Section 2.77. Briefly, if I can speak to this, I would suggest that many of the tables and committees that I've participated on over the years in respect of public health I've heard at those tables, I should say, that Citizenship and Immigration Canada has expressed interest in reviewing the medical screening process. And I think on behalf of all public health practitioners in Ontario, I would strongly encourage that this review be undertaken as soon as possible. Such a review, I think, would have the benefits of not only defining the applicants who present a danger to public health, but would also address system efficiency by considering the impact of such definitions on the whole system, both the healthcare system that Natasha spoke to and public health, exclude those issues that are no longer relevant, such as syphilis, and support the appropriate use of healthcare resources and indeed public health resources as well. If I can call your attention to two particular points, I would like to focus a little bit on tuberculosis and that which occurs at the local public health unit. We have, over the last several years, studied what we have been asked to do as part of the medical surveillance process in respect of tuberculosis, and have come to the conclusion that, in fact, it's too much effort on the part of local public health for not enough benefit. We would strongly encourage that the system requires some review that should be evidence-informed and should take into consideration the perspectives of local healthcare providers and public health providers to ensure that the objectives of the medical screening process are actually being met and being met in a cost-effective and efficient manner. Finally, I'd like to draw your attention to timing and medical examinations under the medical screening process. As I'm sure you're aware, the medical examination, the immigrant medical exam, is valid for 1 year. And I think one does have to wonder, or at least question, whether this makes sense if the individual in question has continued exposure to some of the diseases in question, for example, tuberculosis, while waiting for the results of the immigration application overall. On the other hand, on the issue of timing, we would also suggest that there could be streaming of the process, particularly for those who are already in Canada. And I can tell you of countless stories of individuals who've just completed the medical surveillance process as, say, for example, a temporary worker or a student, and then decide to change their status to immigrant or permanent resident, and then are asked to undergo the entire medical surveillance or medical screening process de novo. And we think that there are opportunities certainly for efficiencies in an examination of the system. So I think with that, we'll bring our remarks to a close and be very happy to take any questions you may have for us.
Thank you, Dr. Crowcroft and Dr. Davila. You'll be pleased to know, Dr. Davila, that we all got press releases today in the House of Commons telling us about March 24th being Stop Tuberculosis Day. So there we all have a little pin. Can you see my pin? Stop tuberculosis.
No, you should wear that pin with pride.
I will. I will. Our first questioner is Ms. James.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to our two guests, Dr. Crowfoot and Dr. Davila. I just want to thank the Chair also for bringing to the attention of both of our guests that March the 24th has been designated as World Tuberculosis or TB Awareness Day. And just to let you know, I am proudly wearing my pin. I wore it in the House today during question period as well. I'm actually going to talk to you a little bit about that. I've noticed in the information that you've brought along that I have in front of me, and also Dr. Davila, you were talking about TB. And I'll let you know that once I was elected on May the 2nd, I received, you received letters and so forth from your constituents. There was a common thread with people concerned about TB and new immigrants or people coming into the country and having that spread throughout Canada. And actually with the World TB Day, the statistics say that there's 4 to 5 new cases each year per 100,000 population in Canada. And I'm just wondering, I think in your notes you said that really shouldn't be a concern, but it certainly is a concern to my constituents. I'm just wondering if you could elaborate on that, please.
So, if I suggested to you that it wasn't a concern, that's not what I intended. I would suggest, though, that the medical screening process for tuberculosis actually takes too much effort for the benefit that's derived. Tuberculosis is an important health problem, and it's, I believe, Natasha, you can correct me, the most common infectious disease in the world. I think 1/3 of the population of the entire world is infected with tuberculosis. The issue is that tuberculosis is one of those diseases where we're particularly concerned with its impact when it's in the active phase and it's in a place where it can be readily transmitted, which is usually the lung or the breathing tract. And those are the cases that we're most concerned with, as those are cases that actually present a risk to others. So the issue that we have in respect of the medical screening process is that it doesn't necessarily help us identify those individuals who are actually presenting a specific risk to other Canadians when they arrive.
I had a question as well. I just wanted to go on with that for just a moment. Some of the information that came out with the Stop TB press release is that there was a particular risk with regards to foreign-born. So, again, my concern is if you were not born here in Canada, why is it a particular risk to people who were born outside of Canada when they come to Canada? Why is that so?
Okay, so again, it depends on which country we're speaking of, but certainly there are countries in the world where the where TB is much more common and infectious TB is much more common. And as a result, in those countries of the world, the likelihood that one actually becomes infected is much, much higher. So certainly I can speak in Ontario, the vast majority of our cases are in the foreign-born.
Thank you very much. You had touched briefly in your report about HIV, I believe, and I think you said it was worthwhile to be included. Are you saying it's not mandatory tested right now, or is it already included in the mandatory testing?
It is included, and it's been included since 2002.
Okay, thank you. I'm just wondering, in your opinion, do you think that CIC requires more mandatory testing outside of what it currently does?
I think what we would suggest is that, again, a review of the objectives of medical screening should be undertaken, and then looking at what tests are actually done in order to achieve those objectives, and understanding whether, in fact, there is evidence to support those tests in terms of achieving those objectives is what should be required. I don't know whether, Natasha, you have thoughts on that.
I mean, I would add to that I think we are both concerned about all of the diseases. There's no question. The question is, what's the best way of detecting them and protecting both the people who arrive in Canada and the Canadians around them? And so I mean, my concern is that the current system isn't the best way to do that. And so to me, the best way to do that would be to do something that isn't really within CIC's remit or mandate. It would be that when people arrive in Canada, be they immigrants or refugees, that they have immediate access to screening in Canada. So, and that is the objective of that is both for the benefit of the immigrant and for the public health benefit.
And what would happen at that point in time, as you're proposing that once they already have arrived and they do have an infectious disease? How do you see that benefiting Canadians that are already here in Canada, Canadian citizens, permanent residents? How do you see that benefiting if someone is actually brought into Canada and is positive to one of those infectious diseases? How would you deal with it at that point?
For TB in particular, so for TB in particular, we have well-established ways of treating them so they are no longer infectious, which is a benefit to them and to preventing further spread. For most of and that's true for most of the conditions. For some of them, it's a question of isolating the person, and there are other preventive measures that can be taken. I think one of the problems is that there's an assumption that if there's a certain amount of screening that goes on before the person arrives, and I'm not taking away from that process, that covers everything. But in some provinces, including my own, when an immigrant arrives, they don't even have access to healthcare. So actually the system may potentially put people at more risk because there isn't an easy way in which somebody can be taken in and checked out fully. So, I mean, I would see it in the same way that everyone has an annual health check. It's that idea that somebody in primary care reviews the health of the new arrival. I also understand, I also want to reiterate that immigrants who arrive in Canada are healthier than Canadians.
I'm sorry to cut you off, Dr. Crowfoot. I've just been told I have less than a minute. I wanted to touch very quickly. You'd mentioned in your remarks that a number of travelers into Canada each year, actually, like in and out of Canada, outnumbers the actual number of immigrants that come into Canada. So you said that there's more of a health concern with people coming out. I think you mentioned SARS and so on. But when I think of Canada and I think of our healthcare system, I think of really strong immunization. I remember, public school, going and lining up in my gymnasium and having those regular intervals of needles, which I desperately hated.
Time's almost up.
And I'm just wondering whether you would say that our immunization in Canada is far better than many of the countries where immigrants are coming from.
I wouldn't rely on it, and the reason I say that is because, we've just had a huge outbreak of measles in Quebec linked to travel to France. Mm-hmm. So I wouldn't rely on it.
Thank you. Mr. Kilway.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and through you to our doctors today. Thank you very much for coming. You're really introducing this issue of health screening to us. We haven't had witnesses under this study yet who have talked about this, so there's a lot of concepts you're putting in front of us and big words like epidemiology.
Good one.
Thank you. That we've got to wrestle with and wrestle down. So let me start with what I seem to me to be kind of the most fundamental question here. You, in the presentation, you talk about the need for a system review and something as fundamental as the objectives of screening as being the subject of that review. Could you elaborate on that? Presumably implicitly there's some criticism of the objectives as they exist now, and I'd like to hear from either one of you or both of you about what you feel the objectives should be.
Let's go ahead.
So I'll start off with that. Again, in respect of public health, right? Again, if the system is meant to protect the safety of travelers and of Canadians, I think the issue isn't so much that there's a problem with that objective. The question is whether, in fact, the current process actually facilitates meeting that objective. And as Dr. Crowcroft suggested, I'm not sure that we're the right persons to speak to public danger or placing excessive demand on the healthcare system. But when it comes to matters of public health, I think the question that I was trying to raise is one of, does the current process and the current medical screening process actually address the objective of protecting public health? And I would suggest to you that there are elements of it that do not.
Okay, so where do we need to start? Is it with the traveler issue? Is it suggested that that's where the greater risks come from for public health here in Canada?
Well, I think there is a very good system for trying to pick up people who are sick when they're travelling. So that's not really the job of CIC. So our discussion of that was really in response to the comment in the report about the 56 reportable diseases that the Public Health Agency of Canada requires, that they were not really, I wouldn't hand that responsibility to CIC because I think it's handled by other measures. There are things like the syphilis screening, for example, which really serves, as far as we're concerned, no real purpose because it comes from 50 years ago when, now we have very good treatments for syphilis. It's not something that it probably causes more problems than it solves, and we have ways of treating people in Canada. So there are some historical elements that could be easily disregarded, and I think, or discarded, I should say. So I think going back to the objectives, if the objective was to protect the health of the immigrant as well as the health of other Canadians, that would be a new objective that would bring a whole load of other potential activities that I think would benefit both the health of would benefit protecting Canadians as well as protecting the health of the immigrants. So the inefficiencies in the current system could be, to a certain extent, mitigated by a system that picks people up when they arrive here and investigates them very thoroughly and treats diseases on, very much more closely to arrival. And so that would really be a new objective for health screening. So
is there a list that there's some consensus on in the public health field that should, a list of diseases that should be subject to screening? Clearly, you've mentioned.
There's actually a very nice. Sorry, there's a. I don't know if you can see this. In the Canadian Medical Association Journal in September, there is a paper that I can send the information to the committee that describes how we would like immigrants to be screened on arrival in Canada. So that work has been done by a multidisciplinary committee with the objective of protecting the health of immigrants. So again, it wouldn't currently fall within the legislation. That's not part of Section 38. It's not in there. So, it would be something new.
Okay. So most of us from Toronto, anyway, remember the SARS issue. And is there a way to capture events like that, prior to an epidemic breakout in a city like Toronto, or is public health all about kind of mitigating? These things will come through. There's no way to stop them, and it's about mitigation on this end.
Well, we do our absolute best to try and know what's going on, and there is a worldwide network of people who are examining data every single day. There's the World Health Organization picks up information from all around the world and relays it to the Public Health Agency of Canada, and a cascade system within Canada that goes through the provincial and territorial governments and into agencies such as the one I work in, and we work very closely to keep a constant watch for new emerging issues around the world. The international health regulations, which you may or may not be aware of, require every country to report to the World Health Organization anything of public health significance, and to do that immediately, and there's a set of criteria. There are some specific diseases that are reportable, but there's also, I think most importantly, a generic one that says anything that is regarded as being unusual and of public health significance must be reported immediately. And the reason that's important is because, of course, SARS, we didn't know what it was until it was here. So we need, the World Health Organization, recognizing the impact that SARS had, knew it had to change its regulations, and so Canada has signed up to that and participates in that, and we benefit from it. So that's a very well rehearsed system.
Thank you, Mr. Lamoureux.
I thank you and appreciate your presentation. I wanted to make an assertion. You tell me if it's right or if I'm off base, and maybe where I might be off base on. Is it fair to say that the risk factor is just as high for individuals that are coming to visit Canada or to immigrate to Canada as the number of Canadians that we have that travel abroad and then return to Canada in terms of health, in terms of the potential impact it could have on the public health here in Canada?
I'm not sure. Yeah, I think it's the travel per se. It depends. It's harder to identify whether it's Canadians traveling or immigrants, but the volume of people traveling, and it's really where they go that represents the risk.
Right.
And the well-known factor is people visiting friends and family. So it's people who are Canadians, but they're visiting friends and family who are in areas of the world where diseases are more common than they are in Canada. But I would like to reiterate that this idea that immigrants pose a risk when they are healthier than Canadians is a little bit of an issue. There are well-recognized risks, and we don't discount them at all.
No, indeed.
It's just in terms of volume and continued exposure. We have huge communities. Eileen knows much better than I do, like in Peel, who go back to India and spend many months there, for example. So,
and if I can, I think on that point, one of the members of the committee was discussing risks associated with tuberculosis. And yes, indeed, tuberculosis is more common and in certain parts of the world, notably parts of Asia, from which we derive many of our immigrants. But the issue is that at the moment that people arrive, there are very few, if any. In fact, if you're actually you have active TB disease and you're infectious to others, you are prohibited from traveling. So in fact, when we're looking at immigrants that arrive in this country, they're not infectious with tuberculosis, for example.
In terms of the public health safety here in Canada, that we're almost better off to say, well, it's great that Citizenship and Immigration is looking at it, but maybe it's much bigger than that we should be incorporating other departments to deal with this particular issue. Is that a fair comment?
it could be. I mean, I'm not sure I know enough about the other departments, but certainly we mentioned the Public Health Agency of Canada at the beginning, so they would be a good group to be involved, for sure.
familiar with any other jurisdiction? Like I've traveled abroad, and sometimes they have individuals that they look like they're medical officers of some sort. You walk by them, you walk through screens, and I don't know what it is that they see of you or anything of that nature. But are you familiar with any other, jurisdictions that treat it, relatively equal about all people that are actually arriving, whether it's through an airport or through a boat?
Mm-hmm. There is certainly a similar system in the UK where there is a port health, it's called Port Health there, sort of portals of entry into the UK, and it's very similar to here that there is somebody whose responsibility is to pick up people who are sick when they're travelling, and
right.
And also people who might present a security risk, not in the sort of terrorist frame, but more people who are, for example, psychologically unstable, and they pick people like that up and either treat them, isolate them, or sometimes they actually send them back where they came from. So, but it is a health role. They have health facilities in the airport or at the port.
But now,
and again, we do have a similar function, right, with quarantine officers. Quarantine health officers.
But now that would also apply, like some sort of basic screening, whether they're local residents or they're immigrants from somewhere else. There's always some sort of a local screening that's taking place in other jurisdictions?
There is, but it's not the detailed screen that we were talking about, where someone, when they arrive, gets fully checked out for things that, like hepatitis or HIV, that you don't see when you walk through an airport. So the airport screening is more about somebody who has, for example, those 56 diseases that are reportable. If they go past with a florid rash and a fever and they look sick, they'll be thinking, has that person got measles or something like that.
Thank you. Mr. Weston.
Thank you, Chair, and thanks, Dr. Crowcroft and Dr. Davila, for joining us. Firstly, I just want to comment, Natasha, you mentioned that immigrants who come here decline in health, and as a great fan of our doctors in Canada, I just want to say it's not your fault.
Thank you.
Yes. Well, we're in public health. So.
A quick question on the matter of syphilis. I just happened to read an article in the national press this week that said that, I think it said that syphilis rates were increasing, and that the problem was that women who were infected might not know they were infected. Now, I may have got that wrong, but did you catch that, and is that consistent with your statement that it shouldn't be part of the screening process?
Yeah, well, I think the problem is that the women are getting infected in Canada, and there are outbreaks in Canada. So it's not an issue that immigrants are bringing to Canada. We have plenty of our own, and the women are screened in pregnancy, but if you then get infected afterwards, during pregnancy, you're not going to get re-screened, and it can be a silent infection. So it's back to safe sex messages, and there's a huge issue with sexually transmitted infections in Canada, but that's our own problem. Like, we have to try and fix that. Immigration's really doesn't bear on it, and travel does to a certain extent. We do have outbreaks that occur in relation to big international events like Caravana and things like that, where you have a lot of people arriving and having partying, and there's alcohol and everything else, but immigration is not the issue.
Okay. One of the great things about our job is we get to cross disciplines, and we had another doctor before us earlier this week, Dr. Chima, who said that one of the issues was the certification of labs, and he said that because many labs are not certified overseas, that there may be problems with identification. In other words, the person who's giving the urine test may not be the person who's registered. And he thought that if labs were certified, that might be a remedy to the problem. Do you see this as an issue where identification documents are being altered and the person who's giving the medical samples isn't the person who's actually applying for immigration or visiting?
I mean,
that's a difficult question.
Yeah.
I don't know that we can speak to the frequency with which one runs into fraud in the system, but I think we can speak to the fact that not all labs are created equal, and there must be reasonable quality assurance measures. So even if you have the right person and their sample appropriately identified, if the test is not done under appropriate conditions, then the result of the test is questionable.
So another recommendation from the same doctor along the same line was to try and centralize the labs any comment on that in terms of trying to achieve that all labs created equal kind of a standard?
I think that's outside our, I mean, you would have to know more about how the labs work in different countries. In some countries it would be easy to get a lab that was accredited fully by some kind of international standard. I think the other piece of it, if you're worried about the identity, is to have the place where the medical tests take place be accredited, because of course there are ways of trying to ensure that people are giving specimens themselves and not bringing them along. So that's something could be addressed not just through the lab but through the medical centre.
Moving on to yet a different idea, pre-screening is something we've talked about on this committee. Pre-screening would allow the Government of Canada to identify each person who comes to Canada by plane or by ship. Do you have any sense of how better pre-screening might help in terms of the safety on the medical side?
Has that ever been an issue with the TB cases?
No, it hasn't really. I would suggest, I suppose that more rigorous pre-screening would actually be more of a benefit to the traveler themselves and the people who are on the journey with them. Clearly if somebody were actively sick with something at that moment in time, then, and you could pick it up at a pre-screening just before the travel, then, something could be done then. The person could be treated and then, recovered before leaving on the journey. But I don't know that we've had particular problems specifically on that issue.
Let me give you a chance to maybe summarize what you've just told us. If you could each make one or two recommendations to improve the quality of our medical security vis-a-vis immigration, what would they be? Maybe Natasha, you can start.
I would change or add a focus to protect the health of immigrants when they and include screening on arrival that was the nature of a health screening. And make sure that, so they'd have to have access to healthcare to do that. So that's one is access to a screening process on arrival in Canada. I suppose another thing would be that the immunisation records should be part of the health check before they arrive. So that's something we didn't emphasise, but yes. I would add that as well.
Eileen, do you have one or two summary recommendations?
I would suggest that we look at the timing, like the validity of the medical examination. Again, right now it's valid for a year. If we're concerned about travel health during the travel and the journey to Canada, the closer that medical examination is to the moment of travel, I think makes more sense. I think the other thing is that there are elements of the medical screening process which are onerous and heavy on the part of local public health. And very paper-intensive for minimal benefit, which is why I would suggest that we review those processes that are currently in place and determine whether, in fact, they do serve the objectives of the current Act and its regulations.
With my last seconds, I'm going to share my time with Mr. Dykstra.
Thank you, Mr. Weston. I appreciate that. Just for clarification, I was just wondering if you could just elaborate on the length of time from the exam to the transfer of the individual to Canada. In other words, you had suggested perhaps 12 months was too long. What would you suggest would be a better time frame in terms of maximum time allowed before you'd have to be reevaluated?
What do you think, Natasha? It's hard to say with this one. I think, some people have bandied about the time of 3 months or 6 months. I think those are more reasonable, particularly for certain diseases.
I would add that also, and in addition, in the opposite direction, that it shouldn't be repeated when the person is in Canada, because the current regulation requires it to be done again when status changes, but that applies if the person's in Canada, and that doesn't make any sense. So that recommendation could be dropped.
Mr. Davies.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm curious about and I'd like to explore a little bit about your comment that immigrants don't have health care when they arrive. and that poses, I think, a health risk, if I had some of your testimony there. Do you recommend that we should provide health coverage forthwith upon arrival as a preventative public health measure to immigrants?
Yes. Yes.
Do you have any data or information to tell us how long it typically takes for immigrants to Canada before they acquire health coverage, on average?
I don't actually have any data on that. It took me 3 goes to get OHIP coverage, even when I was eligible. So,
but in theory, in Ontario, it's 3 months.
Yeah. It's 3 months before you can start.
That's correct. Okay.
And not to belabor the point, but in that 3-month time, I would take it it would be your view that that poses a public health risk not only to those people but to Canadians as well?
Yes.
Okay.
That would be time at which to, yeah.
Okay,
that would be an ideal time to screen.
Okay. Another thing I noticed in your report is that you recommend it would be a good idea if people immigrating to Canada brought with them their immunization records. And I'm just wondering, is that feasible? Is that something that a lot of countries require? Is that something that we could realistically require?
I think it would be hard to require because they may not exist, and it's not a requirement in the sense that you can't come here without them. It's more that if they're requested, people will do their best to bring them, and then when they arrive, especially with kids, they can be caught up. So it's not that you wouldn't stop anyone coming here, but knowing what they have received allows us here to make sure they get any immunisations they missed, which again protects Canadians because then they're not going to put other people at risk.
Okay. Now, I'd like to be clear on this if I can, to get down to simple basics. What do we test for now? When a medical is done before someone comes to Canada as an immigrant, do you know what communicable diseases we test for presently?
There's TB, HIV, and syphilis are the 3 infectious diseases.
Only 3 that Canada requires testing for now. And it's your testimony that syphilis is something that you actually think is not necessarily something that we need to be testing for. Is that right?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay. And I have your list in your notes of what you think we should. I want to shift gears a bit to something else that I don't think you've talked about as much, which is the immigration test of denying entry to someone who may cause excessive demands on Canada's health or social services system. And I notice at page 6 of your slides that we have, you've actually said that too much, that our system through our testing may actually be creating the circumstances by which we're placing an excessive demand and not the actual condition itself. There was a relatively famous case about in the last year of a family in New Brunswick whose child had autism, and the immigration system determined that would present an excessive demand on our medical system. My question is do you feel that the medical community and doctors are being consulted well enough by CIC before that decision is made to deny entry to someone into Canada?
Oh, goodness.
I don't think we're able to answer that question. I'm sorry, that's outside our...
Okay.
Yeah.
Do you know if the medical profession is consulted at all before that decision is made by an immigration official?
I don't know.
I don't know. I personally have not heard of that, but that doesn't mean it doesn't happen.
Okay. I'm probably running out of time. You comment that the health of immigrants generally declines after arrival. I'd like you to sort of expand on that and tell us why and how, and if you have any proposals to address that.
That's a huge topic, and it might be something you might like to ask colleagues at the Centre for Addictions and Mental Health to talk about, because there are specialists there. Some of it is the loss of status, because Canada accepts people on the basis of being highly qualified, but when they get here they often can't work in the fields in which they've qualified, and so socially they're in a different, they go down the social scale, and so a lot of immigrants are willing to accept that. in exchange for the benefits of coming to Canada, but it is also a big change. So psychologically there are some issues. And then, of course, there's the lifestyle and dietary changes that occur, which can also have their toll. But it is it's quite a complex question, and I think I can only, for my part, it was an observation this is the case, and that we were getting healthy people coming here, so we shouldn't be thinking of immigrants as being unhealthy people. But if you want an in-depth account of why that's the case, I would refer you to colleagues at CAMH.
And if I can, from the perspective of Peel Region, where we get a significant number of South Asian new immigrants to Canada, they have a particular predisposition, particularly when exposed to Western diet and lifestyle, towards obesity, diabetes, and cardiovascular disease. So in fact, our environment tips them over the balance on obesity, diabetes, and cardiovascular disease, and they start off healthier and get sicker.
Thank you, Dr. Davila. Mr. Lung.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I wish to go down a different area of medical science. So we talk about the medical screening is a system to pre-screen the immigrant, and also it is to protect Canadians from communicable diseases, and also to protect our very generous health system. What I need to know is, do you also recommend the testing of some latent diseases like hepatitis B, hepatitis C, which can lead to a hepatoma, type 2 diabetes, STD non-specific types, or genetic screening for DNA disorders, or, as you said, post-traumatic stress syndromes, or other psychiatric factors that need to be addressed? Should that also be on our list for pre-screening before we determine admissibility?
In my view, for the diseases, I would just focus on the infectious diseases, hepatitis B and C. While I think they're important, I would think it was more efficient to screen when people arrive, because I would not myself, unless somebody has got serious liver disease in the country of origin, if somebody's just hepatitis B positive or hepatitis C positive on screening, I would not exclude them. So to ensure that they get treated so they don't become a burden, an excessive burden on the healthcare system, my view is the best way to do that would be to screen them on arrival in Canada. If you screen them outside and then a test result, and you don't exclude them when they arrive here, that test result, which is might be done in a non-accredited lab, as we were talking about earlier, it has to find its way all the way through the system to Canada, and then find its way to whichever primary care doctor that person ends up with. So it's, to my mind, those are very good reasons for having screening in Canada, and they are really important diseases. We did a burden of disease study in Ontario, and hepatitis B and C are right up the top of the list of things that are going to be a burden on public health. I absolutely agree with you, they're vital, but I would do the screening in Canada.
Dr. Davila, do you have a comment on that? No?
I agree entirely with Dr. Crowcroft.
Okay. Then this leads me to the next question, which is more of an administrative and ethical one. If we pre-screen the immigrant before arrival in Canada, and then we screen them again in Canada for these diseases, then what do we do? Do we kick them out of this country, or do we admit them as immigrants? Because if we use the health issue or the medical issue as a condition for admissibility, then screening them in Canada causes us a large administrative and ethical issue.
So I would not use hepatitis B and C as admissibility criteria at all. I would screen in Canada, and then what we do is we treat in Canada. So if somebody's a carrier of hepatitis B, we now have effective treatments. If they're not a carrier, if they're negative, then we can offer immunization, which again is a very effective way of making sure they don't become positive. Hepatitis C, again, there are treatments available in Canada that will prevent them getting the other diseases you mentioned, like hepatoma and cirrhosis, and things that will make them become excessive burdens.
But doesn't that put a tremendous burden on our medical system to be the world center for screening for these diseases? Everybody who wants to come in here will take advantage of that and abuse our immigration system as well as our health system.
I'm not sure. I don't think people are going to immigrate to Canada in order to get screened for hepatitis B or C. I'm not sure I understand the question.
If you're suggesting that we screen them once they're here and we're prepared to treat them for it, then that means that they can come in and get screened for these factors and still have the benefit of our health system. What I'm suggesting is my line of thought is that we should protect our health system and our and Canadians to have these immigrants pre-screened before they arrive our shores.
Okay, so we were not proposing that no pre-screening happens at all. And so assuming that these people are screened to the extent that they are healthy individuals when they arrive here, they can still be healthy to all intents and purposes, but some of them, and it's going to be a minority, may carry hepatitis B or hepatitis C viruses by virtue of the fact they come from countries of the world, East Asia and Southeast Asia being very prevalent places for hepatitis B, and other parts of the world having more hepatitis C than is found in Canada. Now, it's not going to be most people, it's going to be a few, but it's a higher rate than is found in Canada. And so it is worth screening them just for those few viruses. And then you can treat them, but it's not going to be a huge burden, put it that way.
Yeah.
Thank you. Mr. Opitz?
I'm going to pass my time to Mr. Dykstra.
Oh, thanks. I'd like to pursue this matter a little bit further. Part of what we're trying to do in this study is determine, respond to the Attorney General's concerns with respect to security, and also he brought up the issue with respect to how few diseases we actually test for, and you've identified those again for us today. But I do have a difficulty understanding how you would actually work through a process that would allow for a second or allows for a second screening here to take place. And I think I understand the principles upon which you outline that. The difficulty that I have with it is that it would lead to abuse in the system, or it could lead to abuse in the system, because if you were then to be tested in your country of origin, you would try to seek a test that would indicate positive, or that would indicate negative, and then knowing full well that you could actually get to Canada, be screened again, and then get full treatment. So what type of rule would we put into place, or what type of what type of defense to this would we put in place? Are you suggesting that before someone were to come to Canada and they were deemed to be have a negative test back home, but a positive test when they come to Canada, that they in fact would have to purchase their own health insurance in order to be treated here? Because what I'm trying to get at is this could lead to quite an expense. For one thing, we'd have folks on Canadian soil, which once they are here, are very difficult to remove. And the second is treatment is obviously going to cost the Canadian taxpayer a lot of money. And I think with our healthcare system today, regardless of which province or territory you're in, there are arguments to be made that we're not. The provinces and territories are not delivering the type of health care that Canadians, find acceptable, at least from a minimum threshold. So I'm trying to make a determination here as to how we would do this, because I understand your recommendation and suggestion, and I think it has some credibility. I'm just trying to determine would like to get from you some recommendations as to how we would alleviate the cost concern and the bogus testing concern.
Yeah. Okay. So just to reinforce it, at the moment we don't screen. At the moment, we don't screen for these conditions at all. Okay. So nobody gets screened, and I don't propose that would change. And at the moment, the inadmissibility on health grounds is about 0.3%. So at the moment, we don't screen, and we don't have people coming here. So right now, people abroad could be saying, I know I've got hepatitis B. No question of faking results. Right. I know I've got hepatitis B, and I could come here and get treated, but actually that's not happening. So I don't propose that gets added to the screening outside the country at all. And the screening that happens inside the country, the way I would frame it is that everybody here is supposed to have an annual health check. This is just an annual health check that happens when people arrive. And when you do an annual health check, you can be screened for hepatitis B. And one of the reasons for screening is if you haven't been immunised in the past, you could be screened to make sure that you need immunising. So I don't want this to sort of get out of proportion, because it really isn't. It's really feasible, and I don't think it's going to present a huge burden.
Right. So we're given to understand that these issues, the types running into persons who actually would be seen as presenting an excessive demand on health or social services are extremely, extremely infrequent. I don't think that the concerns are likely to, manifest themselves. What you're suggesting, I don't think is an issue at all, because otherwise we would have seen it already. Mm-hmm. I think the other point is that presumably the individuals who are chosen for immigration to Canada are chosen for a number of other reasons, health is only one element of the whole picture, and presumably there's actually a whole admissibility procedure that takes into consideration other elements. So I think those are important as well. It's all a balance.
How much on that?
About 30 seconds.
So just on that line of questioning, Dr. Crowcroft, I'm going to give you an opportunity here to make a recommendation on what you would suggest, what guidelines and what path we follow.
In respect of screening on arrival, do you mean?
Correct.
Specifically?
Yes.
Not sure.
Yes, screening on arrival, I'm sorry.
So we have evidence-based guidelines that were published just in 2011, and I would recommend that those were followed. Mm-hmm. That when immigrants arrive, they undergo a health screening that, as per the guidelines, which I can share with the committee if you want to see them. But the work has been done, so that would be the easiest thing to do.
You have less than 4 minutes, Davies.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, doctors, again. I want to make sure I understand your proposal for a more effective and efficient screening process. I can tell you anecdotally in my office, for people waiting overseas to come to Canada, particularly when there's wait times of 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and 10 years, we're requiring them to get medicals that they have to renew every year. And many of those people, they come from second or third world countries. It's expensive for them, and it appears to me that it's not very effective either, if I understand your testimony. What's going through my mind is that we should do one initial screening at the time of application and then simply wait until close to the time they're going to come to Canada, say within 3 months of them being issued their visa. Or, if I understand your proposal, perhaps being tested when they arrive as well. Would that be a more intelligent and effective way to approach health screening in your view?
Yes, I think that's reasonable. I understand that, again, if you're looking for major issues, then yes, those will presumably present themselves on a health screen, at the time of application. If you're looking for issues that present a risk at the time of travel, then clearly that medical examination would have to occur closer to the moment of travel, particularly if you're looking at things like acute infectious diseases, because, again, an exam from a year ago is not relevant.
In terms of that very small number of people who have been deemed inadmissible, I think it's under 1%. Was it 0.6%? I don't know if I caught the number.
So we received 0.3%.
0.3%. Can you give us some idea of what that 0.3% is made up of?
Unfortunately, we can't. This is a presentation that I was able to attend back in June of 2010, and it was a presentation given by a staff member from Citizenship and Immigration Canada. So these are their statistics.
Okay, we have a bit more time. So in that time, I wanted to give you a little bit more time to tell us about the health outcomes of immigrants when they come here. I know it's a complex issue when you started to get into it, and I realize it's certainly not enough time to even scratch the surface. But would either of you care to just tell us a little bit more about the health outcomes of immigrants once they're here?
Your conference is now over. Goodbye.
Can you reconnect us? Sorry, we're getting a message that our conference is over. Can you still hear us?
We can still hear you. Just ignore all that. I don't know where it came from. That wasn't us. Oh, what happened? How can they do that?
Oh, the mistake has to get
What? Instead, I got to look at Davies. This is all on the record, by the way. We will suspend. Okay, we will reconvene our meeting. We have three witnesses from the World Sikh Organization of Canada, who is here in Ottawa with us, Mr. Balpreet Singh, who's a lawyer, and we have by video conference from Richmond Hill representatives from the Centre of Excellence in Security, Resilience and Intelligence, the Suluk Executive Education Center, George Platsis, and Walter Purcell. Good afternoon to all three of you. Mr. Singh, you will have 10 minutes to make a presentation to the committee.
Thank you. Good afternoon. Firstly, I'd like to thank you all for having me here today. The World Sikh Organization of Canada was established 28 years ago as a national representative body of Canadian Sikhs, and also as a human rights organization, a non-profit human rights organization, to advocate on behalf of the human rights of all individuals, regardless of their background. Canada's visa and consular officials are on the ground to ensure that Canadians are safe, and those that are a danger to Canada or have been suspected of having involvement in human rights abuses aren't allowed to enter our borders. It's absolutely imperative that our visa officials have the full support of all of us, including the Canadian government, to do their job and make those hard decisions. I'd like to turn your attention to an incident that took place in May 2010, in which I believe quite the opposite happened. In May 2010, an uproar took place in India with respect to a decision by our visa officers to deny Canadian visas to members of India's security forces. The individuals who were denied were found inadmissible due to alleged human rights violations and also the threat of espionage. After intense pressure from India and some Indian media, the Canadian government apologized for the visa rejections. A statement was issued which clarified that the position of the visa officers in New Delhi doesn't reflect the Canadian government's position. In addition, the statement read, and I'll quote, "This unfortunate incident has demonstrated that the deliberately broad legislation may create instances when the net is cast too widely by officials, creating irritants with our trusted and valued international allies. For this reason, the admissibility policy within the legislation is under active review at this time." I believe that this incident highlighted how our visa system and by default our security can be compromised by political and diplomatic pressures. It's our position that these visa rejections were in fact well thought out and appropriate, and those individuals had no place in Canada. I'd like to take a look at the three cases that were highlighted by the Indian media with regards to the visa rejections. The first was a Punjab police officer by the name of R.S. Katra, who had applied for a Canadian visa to attend the World Police and Fire Games in British Columbia. He'd been posted to an area in the Punjab which suffered severe human rights violations during the late 80s and 90s. According to the Indian newspaper, the Tribune India, in a letter sent to Mr. Katra, Canadian Embassy Vice Consul Sharon Hogan stated that he must be fully aware of the widespread systematic extrajudicial killings and human rights violations by the Punjab police during operations, but he did nothing to intervene to stop them. The letter also read, according to the Indian media, "You are at the very least willfully blind to the crimes against humanity committed by the Punjab police in Amritsar district. During the investigation, arrest, and interrogation during your posting, you may have been indirectly involved or at the very least helped to increase the effectiveness of the Punjab police in Amritsar district at a time when a large number of police forces in the area were involved in the commission of crimes against humanity." As a human rights group that has knowledge of the area as well as this time, that was a completely legitimate observation. Rather than apologizing for Ms. Hogan's position, Canada should have fully supported it. Mr. Katra is himself personally implicated in human rights violations just in the 90s, but a simple Google search will reveal that as recently as February 2010 and again in November 2010, he was accused of kidnapping, illegal detention, and ransacking the house of suspects. Such a person has no place in Canada. The second case that was highlighted by the Indian media was a denial of a Canadian visa to a deputy director of the Indian Intelligence Bureau. The officer was denied a visa on the grounds that he could engage in acts of espionage or subversion or violence that would or might endanger the lives and safety of persons in Canada. Those are very serious concerns and not at all unfounded. Malloy Krishnathar, a former joint director and 29-year veteran of that same force, the Intelligence Bureau, and a former colleague of this individual, was in fact posted in Ottawa for a diplomatic posting from 1983 to 87. In his memoirs titled Open Secrets on page 293, he says that his mission in Canada was to penetrate gurdwaras, Sikh places of worship, Punjabi media, create assets in the Sikh community, and also to generate, quote-unquote, a few friends amongst the Canadian members of Parliament. He writes on page 302 of his memoirs, I do not intend to disclose the details of the intelligence operations that were carried out between Mani Shashi, his colleagues, and me in deference to the niceties of diplomatic protocol, but we did a lot and reached appreciable penetration in the key Sikh-inhabited cities in Canada. Rather than supporting our visa officer's conclusions and reasons, which were once again completely valid, the opposite happened. Indian media reported that that IB officer was in fact granted a visa after the Canadian High Commissioner was summoned to the Indian Foreign Office and conveyed India's displeasure over the earlier decision. The third and final example that was highlighted in the Indian media was a denial of a visa to a member of India's Border Security Force. Eric Werner, First Secretary of Immigration, wrote in the denial letter that former BSF member was associated with, quote-unquote, a notoriously violent force, and that the BSF had engaged in systematic attacks on civilians and had been responsible for systematically torturing suspected criminals. That position would be supported by human rights groups all across the world, including our own. According to Human Rights Watch's 2012 report, BSF members have indiscriminately killed 900 individuals on the Bangladesh-India border in just the past 10 years, with no prosecutions. In January 2012, a video of BSF personnel brutally torturing a Bangladeshi citizen was made public, and Human Rights Watch said that the BSF was a force, quote-unquote, out of control. Mr. Werner's reasoning to keep this individual out of Canada was completely sound and supported by human rights groups. But once again, for some reason, we backed down. Throughout this incident, some Indian media attacked Canadian consular officials as being preachy moralists who don't understand the complexities of a country. A columnist for the Sunday Pioneer in New Delhi, a well-read newspaper, said, and I'll quote, "Since there are no accepted global yardsticks with respect to human rights, Canada has set up its own war crimes section where presumably gullible, starry-eyed youngsters fresh from university and an internship with some ridiculous human rights activist body sit in judgment over the Indian Army." Rather than defending our visa officers who have the expertise to make these decisions, we backed down and promised to review the admissibility policy in the current legislation. This, with respect, was the wrong thing to do. People responsible for human rights violations have no business in Canada, whether they're from India or anywhere else. And with respect, this is not an anti-India position. WSO, my organization, in fact supports increased trade with India, and many of us have family roots in India. So it's important for us to see both countries do well. But keeping human rights violators out isn't in the interest just of Canadians, but also of Indians. The senior editor of the Times of India, one of the most well-read newspapers in India, Manoj Mehta, in a speech here in Ottawa in 2010, which was later republished on his blog, said, "As a journalist tracking legal and human rights issues, as an independent observer of the Indian state's record in these areas, I was delighted to discover the civilizing potential of your rules forbidding entry to those involved in attacks on civilians or terrorism, systematic or gross human rights violations or genocide. As an independent journalist, I cannot help expressing disappointment at your government's retraction on the visa issue." So, to summarize, it's absolutely essential that we support our visa officers and their expertise in making these decisions. What has to come first is safety and not politics. With the brief time I have left, I'd like to turn my attention to another issue. I know that this committee has heard evidence from some witnesses to the extent that the greatest threat Canada faces right now is Muslim immigration. The case of some European countries has been cited as an example of what pitfalls await here if we don't crack down. I would caution you to not accept such impressionistic evidence. The freedoms we enjoy in Canada and the culture of tolerance we fostered and embodied in our charter make us very different from Europe or other countries in the world. The rights that we have here go a long way to prevent marginalization and alienation of minority groups and by default prevent radicalization. As a Canadian Sikh, I know my community in 2010 was the subject of baseless allegations of rising extremism. 2 years later, time has proven that no such thing exists, and young Canadian Sikhs are more engaged today in Canada than they ever have been before, whether it's politics, the army, police. But 2 years ago, the political rhetoric said that extremism was rising. I would ask that you look at these allegations of radicalism in the Muslim community with a large level of skepticism. What we need to certainly avoid is racial or religious profiling of entire communities based on innuendo. That's a turn away from our Canadian values and absolutely inappropriate. Our safety and the security of our borders isn't an ethnic or religious issue. Our focus has to remain on techniques and steps to improve screening and security, and these steps have to apply to all, regardless of their nationality, their ethnicity, or their religion. And those are my comments. Thank you.
You were almost right on time. Perfect. Mr. Platsis and Mr. Pershall, you have 10 minutes between the two of you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, honorable members. My colleague, Mr. Platsis, and I would like to thank you for inviting us to testify today regarding this important issue. We serve as program directors for the Center of Excellence in Security, Resilience, and Intelligence at Schulich Executive Education Center, part of the Schulich School of Business, a global top 10 business school at York University in Toronto. The center has emerged in response to growing concerns of a diverse group of public and private sector stakeholders. Within a context that defines the central motivating driver as increasing rates of change in society colliding with limited ability for adaptation. We are increasingly less prepared for the plethora of changes that define the 21st century, thus defining the probability of failure in both public and private institutions. Within that context, the Center focuses on three particular areas of concern. First, security, where we are not only confronted by international instability, but in a time when we concurrently face emerging challenges such as cyber threats and terrorism, as defined by multiple actors in their various forms. Second, resiliency, where we view that proactivity is better than reaction. And third, intelligence, as both a force protector and a force multiplier, acting as the single most effective proactive measure. This serves as our point of departure for today's discussion. And while the Centre represents and affects the public, private, and academic sectors and nations friendly to Canada, the comments and opinions made during this testimony are our own, do not reflect the view of any of the institutions we are affiliated with, and should be attributed accordingly. The realities of the 21st century insist that the proliferation of information and technology has allowed single individuals to be significant threats to the state, equaling the likes of many of the groups we are currently concerned with. Empirical evidence supports this. In this reality, the core issues of the immigration file are ones of security and intelligence, not technology or procedure or even defense. In an ever-changing environment where threats expand on an exponential basis, any meaningful progress on this issue requires a progressive, integrated, and cooperative approach. The members should know that we see immigration as critically important to Canada. How policy is handled and developed not only plays a crucial role in the demographics and economics of Canada, but also on the culture and the identity of this country. As children of immigrants, our interests are defined by the remarkable possibilities that Canada's diverse multicultural society represents and how it can serve as a template for the world. For all of that, we therefore believe that the net benefit of an effective customs and immigration policy will make entry and exit into Canada more efficient, less intrusive, and ensure Canada's security. However, within this view, our concerns focus not on intentions, but on the vulnerabilities that the current state of immigration policy defines. With that said, I pass over the remainder of my testimony to my colleague, Mr. Platsis.
Thank you. Mr. Chair, committee members, I thank you as well for inviting us, and I do echo the comments of my colleague. There's a concept known as domain awareness, and respectfully, Canada is not aware of its domain. Given Canada's lack of sufficient intelligent capabilities, we seldom know if individuals or cargo accessing Canadian territory pose a threat to the nation, be it of health, safety, or even economic natures. And within that context, unfortunately, a paradox exists where foreign nationals gather intelligence on us, allowing them to use our systems and procedures against us. For all that, we have three major areas of concerns. Internally, a failure to share intelligence and analysis within Canada, something that is well documented in Chapter 2 of the Fall 2011 Auditor General's report, a chapter related to the issuance of visas. Externally, Canada not being sufficiently plugged into the international intelligence community, particularly the Five Eyes. And this is a part of a function that Canada has an inability to share information, as we have no agency mandated to gather intelligence on foreign nationals not residing in Canada. And thirdly, Canada having policies and practices that are viewed as vulnerable to access by certain individuals wishing to gain entry into North America. In this light, the government should ask, why is it that so few applications from known regions of unrest, such as North Africa, Pakistan, and the Middle East, are not identified as potential risks to Canada? To address these concerns, we proposed a layered approach of multiple lines of defense, with one of them being a D-Fate recommendation of admissibility based on intelligence that is responsive to national security concerns, not domestic and foreign political pressures. Validated sound intelligence ensures legitimate visitors and business travelers, refugee claimants, and immigrant workers and entrepreneurs are let in, and war criminals and terrorists are kept out. Under such a structure, people without legitimate claims would not even get near Canadian territory, and we feel such an approach would have helped avoid recent revelations of Canadian war criminals living in Canada. On the discussion of biometrics, we have found it to be useful, the Nexus system being a good example, but the question is not the question should be how technology is used, not if it is useful. In fact, it is inefficient and even a waste of funding for Canada to invest in biometric technologies without proper intelligence backbone structures to make these technologies worthwhile. Generally, there are two camps regarding biometrics. The first camp says using them as a mechanism to confirm identity. The second saying cross-referencing against shared databases with a view to understanding the history of a person. Respectfully, the suggestion of the first camp adds little value. Sophisticated forgery, albeit expensive in some cases, is readily available throughout the world and can easily circumvent this security initiative. I would ask you to consider the following scenario. An individual from Africa or Asia enters Albania, a relatively easy country to enter these days. From Albania, this individual makes their way to an EU member state, such as Italy, Bulgaria, or Greece, where gaining access to Canada from an EU member state becomes infinitely easier. However, along the way, this individual could have changed their identity by obtaining false documentation that can include forged and phony biometric data. This possibility certainly exists, and criminal groups have the technological means to do this. Finally, this individual reaches a Canadian entry point. Cross-referencing their data against false documentation tells a CBSA official one thing: the biometric data matches false documentation. And it is also only at this point where Canadian agencies would begin to build a file on this individual. Reconsider the same scenario, this time where data is cross-referenced into a larger Canadian database, which also includes the Five Eyes because Canada has ventured into a cooperative effort with its allies. All this adds a significant value to Canadian authorities so they could get a better understanding of the individual's history. The primary issue here is that Canada has little international capacity for matters of intelligence and is only compounded by limited international cooperation on these same matters. The minimal information we have today is compiled from our missions, yet these missions lack resources such as intelligence capabilities, leaving screening officers with little to make meaningful assessments. This situation is only exacerbated as in many cases screening officers may not even be Canadian nationals. Simple things such as talking with local law enforcement is difficult to accomplish as we lack resources and networks. And we suffer from internal issues as well. If the RCMP or CSIS may have somebody in their watch list but do not inform CBSA, it is not the fault of CBSA for letting the individual into the country. It is the fault of the system for not ensuring necessary agencies can easily integrate and share their information. What this demonstrates is that Canada needs to know more about the individual before they approach Canada. This, in a nutshell, is domain awareness. This situation becomes even more daunting due to inadequate ongoing training and an over-reliance on technology, risking both increased danger and complacent behavior. Therefore, investing in sophisticated technology here in Canada is of little use to us if we have no information to cross-reference the technology against. Better pre-screening requires investment abroad, not here. There are even simple tactics which could give Canadian authorities the necessary resources to address claims swiftly, but more importantly, allow them to make the right decisions. For all that, there's an underlying issue that cannot be overlooked. This is the cyber threat. If Canadian agencies do decide to work in a more collaborative effort, which in our opinion they should, there's the issue of information assurance. If Canada goes down the route of biometric and similar technologies that build a database of personal information, we suggest that CIC and CBSA have IT security measures that are at least as good as the RCMP and CSIS, if not better. Without these measures, these agencies do become prime targets for foreign agencies seeking to find information on their own nationals or nationals of rivals. In essence, a lack of information on assurance on Canada's part becomes a treasure trove for foreign agencies. Part of the problem that exists within the Canadian context, and we cannot overemphasize this, is one of resource management and resource utilization. Ironically, this is not a function of technology, but a function of human resources. There are individual Canadians and Canadian institutions that, 1, have the knowledge and expertise, 2, have the domestic and international networks, and 3, can play a critical and positive and important role in this dialogue. Unfortunately, Canada's current state, individuals and institutions are sidelined, rendering their invaluable resources not only underutilized, but in many cases not even recognized, as the Canadian structure is either unaware, unable, or unwilling to engage these individuals. Domain awareness will allow us to work closer with our natural allies. As the domain becomes more secure, Canadians should enjoy more freedoms, greater ease of travel, potential and...
Mr. Plattis?
Yes.
You're way over.
Yes.
Perhaps you could make a concluding statement.
Sure. I'll give you my summarizing right here. In summary, we should note that we have only begun to address the myriad of issues. The immigration and security file is a cause in which you are all united. You have all been mandated as representatives of the people. However, your first responsibility is the security of the Dominion and the people. Vigilance is a price that must be paid and constantly paid, for if we do not, we risk opening up ourselves to ignorance and manipulation. We thank you, and if you have any further questions, we would be delighted to answer them.
Thank you to all three of you. Mr. Opitz has the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Gentlemen, welcome. Welcome all. Thank you very much for being here today. I have 7 minutes, so I'm going to hit you with a lot of questions, but hopefully if you can keep your answers fairly brief, because I would like to get as much out as we possibly can. Pardon me. Mr. Platsis, just a while ago you spoke about domain awareness, and or could be more broadly interpreted as situational awareness, and you mentioned CSIS, CBSA, the RCMP, are unable presently to share information. Can you expand on this, and how collecting some of this info can be aggregated, shared between these agencies? And I know in your bio that you worked in Washington extensively, and perhaps you can draw on some of those experiences.
Thank you, Member Opitz. Yes. I think to broaden this discussion, we need to look at it from initially in a historical context. In historical context, the RCMP and CSIS, and expanding out into other groups, like all organizations, they are not immune to cultural barriers. There's a term, since you mentioned my Washington days, there's a term that intelligence begins at the local level and it works all the way up to the national level. Within that context, we are constrained by silos. So each organization, as a function of their culture, operates individually. Something that Professor Birchall and I work closely on is trying to break down these silos so that the RCMP, CSIS, CBSA can all talk to each other. From my days working in the disaster emergency management field, we have a saying, the time to exchange business cards is not when the disaster occurs, but well before that. So I think as a very initial first step, the agencies need to start talking to each other, which I think, based on plenty of information that is available in the open source, this is something that they are not doing.
Great. And I know at some of the missions abroad, when you talked earlier, and a part of that gathering can also start on the human level, which I think they can pass in. I'm going to ask you very quickly, because you mentioned the 5 I's without defining them, and just for the benefit of everybody, because they're nodding, can you quickly tell us what the 5 I's mean?
Sure. The 5 I's are the 5 countries of the United States, United Kingdom, Canada, New Zealand, and Australia. This has been a collaborative effort that I think ranges back 50 to 60 years on intelligence gathering materials. These are natural allies that shortly after World War II realized they had shared interests.
Great. I'm going to address now Colonel Purcell, and from your military background in particular, I'd like you to talk about a couple of things very quickly. Your opinion of what are the greatest threats to Canada that you perceive at this time. And so why don't we just start with that? What are the greatest threats that you think are facing us right now?
Thank you, Mr. Opitz. There's a lot. The biggest threat is the one we've defined as our point of departure, and that, of course, is the fact that the rate of change that is continually accelerating that affects us in every possible dimension of national activity is far outpacing the capacity of our institutions to adapt to that change. Consequently, we have a growing delta between the capacity, for example, of law enforcement to deal with new criminal activities, growing delta between our capacity to acquire information that is critical to us, particularly with respect to considerations as associated to this file, and in fact the list goes on rather endlessly. What we believe is absolutely essential to the security of the Dominion is very simply that what we need to do is be proactive and start leaping forward in time as opposed to relying on traditional institutional measures which very clearly are failing. Specifically with respect to this file, because I don't want to diverge from the committee's interest, because this is a very long answer that would follow, but again, specifically with respect to this file, the system cannot be adequate when there is a guesstimate that there are between 200,000 and 500,000 undocumented individuals currently living in this country. Taking into account what we call the 1% rule, that 1% of them could present a significant threat to this country, within the context, again, of this file alone, that represents a significant national threat and potential threat in both criminal and potentially terrorist activities.
Would you categorize that 1% as a potential extremist threats?
I think within that 1% you'll find a range. You'll find a range from people that just don't like us very much to people that can present a very serious danger, and regrettably, historically, Canada has experienced elements of both of those extremes.
This could be to either of you. So, pardon me, so how would you find linking biometrics to the intelligence gathering protocols that you're discussing?
Okay, I'll take the first stab at that. I think this was brought out in the testimony where biometrics serves little use if it has no information to be cross-referenced against. And as mentioned, the information gathering starts abroad, so we need to give our visa officers and our embassies the capabilities and the intelligence resources that they could actually start finding out about a person abroad. When we have this information, which is a Canadian database, biometric information can then be confirmed against that, as opposed to simply carrying around a card or any biometric information that says, yes, I am George Platzis, so when I can very easily manipulate the data on that card or passport to make my name Joe Smith. That's my quick take.
Just a quick addition to that. I think where we are on biometrics is it is something that we need to look at very clearly, but I think we're in an interim step. Ultimately, the biometric that will define activities and travel in the world is probably going to be DNA-based. But until we get to that time, we are reliant on databases, and the more integrated they are, the more capable they are of exchanging multiple degrees of data on who allegedly claims to be who they are, the more useful they will be to our defense.
Thank you, Mr. Purcell. Mr. Sabayisan.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I want to thank all of our witnesses for being here today. I'd like to direct some of my questioning to you, Mr. Singh, since you're here. And I have some questions with respect to the temporary resident visa program. We've heard from multiple witnesses now, and statistics also show that the Library of Parliament researchers have provided for us that there's a large discrepancy in the approval ratings of the temporary resident visa between the Chandigarh office and the New Delhi office. And Chandigarh has a refusal rate of approximately 50%, and I've also heard a number of examples, including in my constituency, where gurus are actually denied visa to come to Canada to attend Sikh gurdwaras, or imams refuse to come to mosques. What are your suggestions for improving our visitor visa system?
Thank you for the question. You're right. I think the statistics we have is that 53% is the rejection rate at Chandigarh. And we're approached regularly with people that come to us and say a family member has come here before and was rejected a second time. And gurdwaras, places of worship for the Sikh faith, have what's called a spiritual deficit right now, in that the congregations are growing and there's not enough people to service those congregations. And the issue has been that people that have been here in the past are even being turned down. And certain areas from the Punjab specifically have a much higher rate of being turned down. For example, the Amritsar district, which I mentioned in my presentation as being quite disturbed in the late 80s and early 90s. I understand that ragis, or preachers, are turned down regularly from that area, which is unfortunate because the center of the Sikh faith is in fact in Amritsar district. What definitely needs to happen is some measure of consistency. If someone is here in the past, we can't figure out on our end why they wouldn't be able to come back again. I know gurdwaras have forwarded a number of suggestions with respect to better communication with them. Often these preachers will show up without the gurdwara knowing that they're coming or not. So I think communication is definitely, and consistency is something also that I would recommend.
Okay, thank you. And I'm going to change gears a little bit. I mean, it's not just the Sikh faith, it's the Islamic faith. Even in my constituency, I've had it with Hindu priests as well, so pundits coming and having problems getting a second visitor visa, or many even the first. Changing gears, though, to the topic of detention. We've had multiple witnesses once again talk about detention and the problems. I guess I could direct this to all of our witnesses. And the government's recent, and how detention, the problems that detention poses for the immigrants themselves, whether it's temporary or permanent. The government's recently pushing through a bill, Bill C-31, which proposes mandatory detention for all of those who arrive to our country in what they call irregularly, in an irregular fashion. And what are your opinions on this?
Our organization has a position on that. We do oppose that bill, namely because a number of people, even if they're recognized as legitimate refugees, will be detained, and even if they're accepted after the whole process, they won't be given travel documents for quite a long time. They're essentially in limbo. And once again, that's not how we treat refugees in Canada, so I would not be in agreement with that.
I mean, we've had lots of examples of where people who were mandatorily detained are actually, many of them are real refugees or refugee claimants. Mr. Purchell or Platsis, do you have comments you'd like to add to that?
I think your question underlines our point. I believe if we had more effective intelligence, if we were more effectively pre-screening before people landed in Canada, we would have far less of a problem or far less of a concern with respect to the respective rights of individuals arriving. The problem is we don't know who these folks are, therefore we cannot make a reasonable assessment of the potential risks or threats they represent to Canada. Again, the bottom line is a simple one. We need to ensure the security of Canada above all other things. If we have information about this person before they get on an airplane, if we know who that person is, we can make a reasonable and effective assessment of risk.
So would you say then that it's important to ensure that our visa officers around the world have access to more resources so that they could do their work and not be rushed? We've had CIC, I'm not sure if it was CIC officials or actual former visa officers who actually testified to this committee saying that on average a visa officer has about 5 minutes to decide whether they're going to accept or reject a specific applicant. So would you say that in fact these visa officers we need to ensure that we have Canadian-trained visa officers who are in these posts around the world making those decisions and have better training or resources made available to them?
The critical question isn't time. The critical question is information. And that is to say, on what basis do you review your 5 minutes? If you have a complete or a reasonably complete file that has been vetted by someone who understands the nature of the file itself, and that would not necessarily be a visa officer. One of the things we're considering is actually having intelligence officers in this concept that doesn't exist yet vet those files. We see that as a more effective means than allowing somebody to arrive in Canada and then spending an inordinate amount of time and money trying to deal with the consequences of that arrival.
Sorry, Mr. Pritchard, I have about 30 seconds, I think, remaining. So I'd like to ask, are those files available now? Do we already have those files here and are not being made available to our visa officers? Like, are those files available already?
I would think for the most part we have very few, if any, files on most of the people that we cannot identify. That's why we can't identify them.
Thank you. Mr. Lamoureux.
I have a very small amount of time, so I'm going to see Mr. Purcell and Mr. Singh, if you could both answer the same question. I want you to imagine, it's to kind of follow up on the question that you were just asked. Imagine that you work 8 hours a day, you sit in Chandigarh, and every day you're given 80 applications for a visiting visa. So you have to go through and make a judgment call on 80 of them. You know your colleagues on your right and your colleagues on your left, you have an approval rating of about 50%. Sometimes a little higher, sometimes a little lower. But there is no doubt it's right around that 50%, and that's been fairly well established. My question is, what impact is that going to have on you, and do you see that as a problem in terms of pre-screening? If you can each just take like a minute to answer this.
I will defer to Mr. Singh.
Clearly, there's a lot of applications that go through the Chandigarh office. I mean, I'm not knowledgeable of other offices, but there obviously need to be more staff there is what our understanding is. Secondly, with respect to security, there are definitely flags that must go up when certain things appear on a file, for example, service in certain security forces, etc. And I suppose those files need greater time. But as far as our community is concerned, the level of rejections from the Chandigarh office is absolutely, it's unacceptable.
Mr. Singh, one of the things that I've noticed is in looking at these rejections, and I'd ask for you to provide comment on, is it seems to be a lot of siblings and parents. These are individuals that are coming in hopes to be able to visit special occasions, whether it's weddings, birthdays, graduations, just to be in Canada, to be in the environment in which their children are now living. Do you see those types of individuals applying to be able to come to Canada as completely different from others that might be trying to come to Canada? And what would you think, is there something that we can do to speed up that process or enable them to be approved in a quicker fashion?
I don't know if I would say that they're completely separate or a different category. Once again, if certain flags go up on any file, those deserve a little bit more special attention. I understand that the super visa, from the reaction from our community, has been quite successful with respect to speed as well as approval rates. So I think there's something good happening there, and if we can learn something from the super visa system, perhaps that's something that we can apply to other visitor visas.
Yeah, I know my colleague across the way might have liked to have heard that. One of the issues that I've had from the Indo-Canadian community is the affordability of getting the super visa. Do you believe that that is a bit of an impediment or a large impediment for many members of the community to be able to apply for?
The insurance is quite costly, and that definitely is a barrier for some families. But for those who can afford it, it has worked well. But once again, there are those families that can't afford it.
Okay. Mr. Purcell, I'm going to go back to you in regards to the question of resources. Is it possible to process large numbers in a short period of time and say that it's being done adequately? Or is there a need to ensure that there is more resources where we have embassies where there's a high demand? India is just one of them. There's a half dozen where there's a huge demand. Is there a need to put more resources for pre-screening of approvals?
The critical variables. The critical variable, I think, is the use of current resources and how efficiently they are interrelated into common database. My colleague talked about the fact of silos. We're not sharing effective information or wrong information effectively, and accordingly, it's very difficult in the amount of time given and with the people that we have on the ground to make an informed assessment. The question is informed assessment, and that is a product of intelligence-based information. That's what we need to do. Now, the level of efficiency and effectiveness, I'm afraid that would probably require a bit of study to look at the degree of employment, the degree of interoperability, the degree of current sharing. To the best of our knowledge at this point, working from the outside and looking in, we are not convinced that any of that is happening particularly effectively.
Thank you. Mr. Lung.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. My question is actually for all three of you, but I wish to, first of all, address this to Mr. Plattis and Mr. Pershall. You mentioned that part of our information sharing comes from the Five Eyes. You mentioned that there is an opportunity to use biometric collection and perhaps a process of intelligence gathering. My understanding from my previous work is that a lot of this is very easily done when there is a situation of human conflict, as in the start of the Gulf War and Afghanistan. But given our current capability in a peacetime, or relatively peacetime situation, what is your recommendation for risk mitigation as for today, immediately, and for the near future? I mean, how do we start to establish this intelligence gathering apparatus that will feed into what we need it for? I mean, maybe the information is out there already. You mentioned the siloing effect. Do we need to have that sharing, cross-pollination, perhaps with the other agencies, rather than having to create something totally on by ourselves? Therefore,
go ahead. Speak up. All right. I think the critical factor here is actually starting with properly identifying a risk analysis. I think that's where we actually need to start this and see where are our risks, where are vulnerabilities. Further to that, the information collection, even in a peacetime setting, we still have opportunities and networks that we can chat with friendly nations. And as I mentioned, the Five Eyes is only a departure point, because we don't have immigrants coming just from the Five Eyes. They are coming from all over the world. I'm actually going to defer to you on this one, because this is your area of expertise.
Well, what I would like to see is more interoperability. And I think more interoperability with the current resources would establish our baseline of where we are and where we need to go and be. That interoperability would focus and center around, in my view, around a common database, a very well-secured database that would force multiply our capacity, again, to make informed decisions in peacetime. We have the government of Canada has invested a great deal of money in technology. We have invested a great deal of money in various institutions. I think what we would like to see is more effective interchange of the information those institutions have and the degree to which they share that information for the purposes of making those decisions, again, well before anyone has the opportunity to enter Canada itself.
There are situations whereby intelligence could be gathered with hard facts and hard evidence, such as someone being involved physically in training with terrorist groups and the likes, or belong to organizations that are known terrorists. I'd like you to share your thoughts on how do we determine intent? How do we determine whether a person coming in has evil, nefarious intents to, and how do we mitigate that risk?
I think we don't determine intent on a 5-minute review of a file. I think if we have a concern, again, we start with a risk assessment. If we see this as a potential risk, then again, what we are increasingly dependent on in that particular case or cases is getting additional intelligence until such a point that we are satisfied that we have an understanding of the individual file to the extent that we can speak to the notion of intent. That is not going to be done quickly. That requires time, it requires effort, but for all of that, it's infinitely cheaper and more effective to do it outside of Canada than allow it to be done in the course of landing somebody and then going through a myriad of processes that are both costly and no more effective in coming to the conclusion you're looking for, sir.
I certainly share that desire to have these pre-screened before they land in Canada. But what we're faced with is a conundrum that if we do the screening offshore and do it to the extent that satisfies the risk mitigation, it will take a long time. So perhaps you can share your thoughts on how we can perhaps shorten this process.
We shorten the process as a function of the application of technology. If we have common effective databases, we have a greater capacity to respond externally as opposed to internally. Those databases can be assembled in Canada and made available to those making the decisions at our various visa and consular officers abroad.
You said, got a minute, over a minute. Rick, you want to carry on? I'll share my time with Rick Mustadi, sir.
Thank you, Chair. One of the areas that I just wanted you to quickly comment, I know we don't have a lot of time, but the fact is that that is the actual issue. The timing is for a lot of these applications, from the applicant's perspective, is of the essence. So I know one of the complaints that a lot of us get in our writings isn't so much just the fact whether someone's been denied a visa, for example, but that it has taken so long for a conclusion to be driven to that, in fact, it doesn't matter whether they get an approval or denial, because the reason they wanted to come here, the purpose of the visit has actually elapsed. So I wondered about, in your experience with other countries in terms of the process that they use, where time is a factor, what have they been able to do, and where can we look to from that perspective to countries to assist us in working through this process so that, in fact, we can come up with a conclusive and right decision 99% of the time, and one that is done in an effective and efficient manner?
Respectfully, the timing issue has to be secondary to the consideration of our national interests. And what that means is, what do other countries do? One of the things other countries do is they operate foreign intelligence services precisely for the point of, among other things, gathering information to lower the degree of risk that they would be exposed to with respect to decision-making processes. I fully appreciate the great difficulty a member would have getting pressure from a group of people or a community of people seeking to expedite something. While that is understandable, it is secondary, I believe, to the concerns of the security of the state. And again, what we need to do is put into place those systems, those procedures, and if necessary, those additional capabilities to allow us to do that in an efficient and timely manner with a view to our primary consideration, which is national security.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Davies.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Purchell, our notes here indicate that you're a lieutenant colonel with the Canadian Armed Forces. Is that correct?
I am a reserve officer with the Canadian Armed Forces.
Okay, thank you. If I can address this to Mr. Platzis and Lieutenant Colonel Purchell, you seem to be men of data, men of fact, and you've used the term risk assessment. So I'm going to examine some of the underlying suppositions that I think inform this debate. We had a person testify before this committee who gave us data of the last 11 years of Canadian court decisions and exclusions, IRB exclusions. And what the professor found was that the number of potential refugees that were excluded because of terrorist concerns is infinitesimally small. It's 0.01%. She also indicated that That is notwithstanding that the definition of terrorism has expanded considerably over the last 10 years since 9/11 in particular, and that she thought that many people caught under this label are actually quite remote from any actual activity, let alone any kind of threshold. But as we've expanded our definition, more people are caught under this. She also gave us a chart that showed that we excluded 63 people out of 20,000 decisions in 2000. That's prior to 9/11. 71 people were excluded in 2001, which was largely prior to 9/11, sort of about two-thirds of the year gone. And in 2006, 7, and 8, we've excluded 79, 65, and 79. So the numbers are that, and I'll put this thesis to you for your comment, is there really a factual-based problem that shows that there has been any increase in terrorist-type immigration problems compared to 9/11, or are we just more sensitive or alive to that now?
I'm not going to take issue with the 0.01% if you're looking at terrorism. I think what has changed is fundamentally the capability of a single individual to perpetrate very significant acts of terrorism against the country. It's not the number that is critical, it's what's doable. In the 21st century, with the download of technology, as I said in a paper I wrote, it is now possible for a single individual to make war on the entire planet with the application of technology for the purposes of leveraging intent. The issue is not, however, confined to terrorism. There is a second concern, and that is criminals and criminal operations and criminal networks. One of the other things that we're seeing in the 21st century is a convergence between criminal organization and terrorist organization. So the absolute number is no longer 0.01%, but it is greater. Having said that, whether it is less than 1% or not is not the significant variable. The significant variable is the threat potentially greater to Canada as we go forward in time. And the answer to that question, sir, is absolutely yes.
If I might just say that, is that much different than it was before 2001? I mean, was there not a convergence of criminal behavior with terrorist behavior, say, in 1995? And is the technology that much different from 1999 than it is, say, in 2012, in your view?
Absolutely, sir. And I say this respectfully. Your computer in 2001 and your computer in 2012 are substantially different. And that's a very commonly held item. The reality is that that threat level has multiplied exponentially, not even in a linear manner. And I'll defer to Mr. Platzes for additional comments on that.
Well, I was going to echo that. I'm echoing that completely because when you consider there are certain laws in technology, there's the, I'm forgetting which name, but it's the 18-month rule where technology capability can double in 18 months. Just consider this scenario. In the end of 2008, the fastest known supercomputer could do 1.5 quadrillion calculations per second. That was in 2008. We're already in 2012. Many of the capabilities that you could do from a technological perspective, be it anything from biological, chemical, explosive warfare, is stuff that you could readily find on the internet, on open source. It's just a matter of digging. And further to that, there are cookbooks out there where the single individual does have the capability to do this. In 1995, as you mentioned, first of all, you did not have the access to the information. Now the information is scattered all over the place in multiple languages, going across very different contexts. And this also includes...
That's it, I'm afraid. Thank you. We are out of time. Mr. Zimmer, you're our guest today, and we're going to give you a whole minute.
Wow, thank you for that minute. I'll try and use it wisely. Just a question for Mr. Platzes. You spoke of biometrics, and I guess you spoke with some, I won't say disdain, but I guess you had some questions and issues with it. And I guess I would just ask you back, what is your opinion regarding sharing that biometric information? Would that not help alleviate I guess the questions you have with biometrics and using other countries' data? Can you answer that?
Well, I think I'm going to answer that question very, very quickly and tell you that I'm a Nexus card holder.
Okay.
So I think that should answer it.
Yeah, okay. So elaborate on the whole theme of biometrics, though, and what we're talking about in a broader sense.
to take this from a flip perspective and using the Nexus reference as an example, I do travel to the United States frequently, and to make my life and my travel easier, I recognize I am going into another sovereign country, and I have to respect their laws and their rules, much the same way anyone coming into Canada would. For all that, to make my life easier, I realize that I need to give up a part of my individuality. In this case, fingerprints, which I had already given for a previous visa, and an iris scan. So on that point, I do not have an issue with biometrics being used, because it is used against a larger database to confirm, number one, my identity, but also to confirm that I'm there for legitimate intent. So when I go down to the United States, I'm going there for legitimate intent, and this is why I use a Nexus card. The flip side of that is if the Nexus system was simply just to identify who I am by matching biometrics to iris or to fingerprints, if there's no database to compare against, my card can say Joe Smith, and when I show up to a border, it will say Joe Smith, and yes, this is Joe Smith. That's my issue that I have with biometrics. Thank you.
Thank you. You got a whole 2 minutes. Thank you. Welcome. Mr. Platzis, Mr. Pershall, Mr. Singh, I'd like to thank the three of you on behalf of the committee for your contributions to this committee. Thank you very much for coming.
Thank you.
This committee,
Thank you.
This committee is adjourned.